Parasites are one of the most terrifying concepts in all of horror, and the reason is simple. Every other monster attacks you from the outside. A parasite gets in, takes the wheel, and leaves just enough of you alive to watch. The real world already has versions of this. The Cordyceps fungus hijacks ants, forces them to climb to a precise height, locks their jaws around a leaf, and erupts through their skull to infect the colony below. The Toxoplasma gondii rewires rat brains to make them attracted to cats, because the parasite needs to end up inside a cat. Nature already figured this out a long time ago. Horror just scaled it up. Today we are looking at the scariest depictions of parasites in fiction. The ones that use you, transform you, and in some cases make sure you stay conscious long enough to understand what is happening. Some of these are pure cosmic horror. All of them are going to stick with you. Let's begin. We begin with one of the most strategically terrifying and cosmically horrifying parasitic organisms ever conceived in fiction, and one that unfortunately does not get nearly enough credit outside the Warhammer community. The Genestealers are the vanguard of the Tyranids, an extragalactic species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, whose singular purpose is to consume all biomass in existence. If the Tyranids represent an apocalyptic force of cosmic consumption, the Genestealers are their advanced scouts, their silent infiltrators, the instruments that arrive decades or even centuries before the main fleet and prepare the ground for total annihilation. And the way they do it is one of the most disturbing biological mechanisms in all of speculative fiction. A Genestealer does not kill you when it catches you. That would be far too simple and far too merciful. What it does instead is infect you. It introduces a fragment of its own genetic material directly into your body through what the lore describes as the Genestealer's kiss, a bite or a surgical insertion that rewrites your biology at a fundamental level. And from that moment on, everything changes. The infected human appears completely normal. They go to work, they maintain relationships, they raise families. From the outside, nothing is different. But inside, a new loyalty has been written into them at a level deeper than thought or choice. The infected individual does not feel controlled. They feel devoted. They feel with absolute sincerity that the Tyranids and the Genestealers that serve them are something sacred, something to be protected, to be served, to be welcomed. This is the core of what makes the Genestealer infection so uniquely horrifying compared to other parasitic mechanisms. It does not produce a mindless thrall. It produces a true believer. And when the infected individual has children, those children are born already deeper into the cycle. The progression across generations is what the lore calls the Genestealer cult, and it works like this. The first generation, the original human who received the Genestealer's kiss, looks completely human. There is nothing physically aberrant about them. No medical scan, no visual inspection, no blood test available to a standard human civilization would flag anything wrong. They live, work, and serve the cult in silence. The second generation, the children of the infected, begin to show minor physical differences, slightly altered skin texture, eyes with an unusual depth or color, subtle facial restructuring that is hard to place but impossible to fully ignore if you are looking closely. They can still pass as human in most situations, particularly if they are careful, but the devotion runs deeper than in their parent. They have never known a version of themselves that was not part of the cycle. The third generation is hybrid in the truest sense. They are still bipedal, still capable of speech, still capable of operating within a functional society if the need arises. But the physical alterations are now undeniable. Partial, chitinous plating, additional limbs or restructured ones, eyes that reflect light in ways human eyes do not, claws where there should be fingers. They move through the world in disguise when necessary, which is increasingly difficult, and with open ferocity when the time comes. The fourth generation is a Genestealer. The human lineage has been fully overwritten. The cycle has produced what it was always working toward. And here is the element that makes this biological strategy so devastatingly elegant and so completely horrifying. Those fourth generation Genestealers can infect new humans, and the cycle begins again. While simultaneously every generation before them is embedded in the civilization they are dismantling. They are the neighbors and the co-workers and the politicians and the military officers. They have been accumulating resources and influence and information for decades. They have been mapping weaknesses and sabotaging defenses and positioning themselves in places of maximum leverage, all while appearing to be ordinary members of the community they are hollowing out from within. And then the fleet arrives, and by the time the first Tyranid ship breaks atmosphere, the civilization it is descending upon has already lost. The cult rises at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability and attacks from inside every system simultaneously. The defense networks they helped build are suddenly weapons pointed inward. The leaders they helped elect are now opening gates rather than closing them. The physical capabilities of Genestealers in direct combat are, on their own, already exceptional. They are faster than any unaugmented human, stronger than power-armored soldiers in close quarters, and nearly impossible to stop once they have closed the distance. Their claws are not merely sharp, they are designed to bypass armor, to find the gaps, to take apart whatever is in their way, with a mechanical efficiency that speaks to millions of years of evolutionary refinement. But none of that is what makes them genuinely terrifying in the context of this list. What makes them genuinely terrifying is the time scale. The Genestealers do not operate in minutes or hours. They operate in generations. They measure their strategy in decades. And the most chilling part of that patience is that it is not even a strategy in the way a general plans a campaign. It is biological. It is instinctive. The Genestealer does not choose to be patient any more than a river chooses to find the lowest path. It is simply what it does, and what it does, given enough time, is inevitably effective. In the Warhammer lore, there are records of entire planets that fell not because the Tyranids overwhelmed their defenses from outside, but because by the time the fleet arrived, there were no defenses left to overwhelm. The Genestealer cult had already dismantled everything from within. Civilizations that had held for centuries against external threats collapsed in weeks when the cults revealed themselves. The final horror of the Genestealers is that there is no known cure for the infection, no treatment that reverses the genetic rewriting, no way to undo what the Kiss has done. Your children will be born into the cycle. Their children will be more deeply in it, and your grandchildren will be something else entirely. The parasite that writes itself into your bloodline across generations and waits patiently for the appointed hour is, in many ways, the most inevitable thing on this list. If the Genestealers are the most patient parasites on this list, the Thing from John Carpenter's 1982 masterpiece is the most philosophically devastating, because the Thing does not just infect you. It does not just use you, it replaces you, completely, perfectly, without leaving a single detectable trace. The Thing is based on the 1938 novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr., and the central conceit of both the source material and Carpenter's film is deceptively simple. An alien organism is discovered in the Antarctic ice, having been frozen there for tens of thousands of years. When it thaws, it reveals a capability that no prior science fiction monster had explored with this particular focus. The Thing can imitate any living organism it comes into contact with, not just externally, but at the cellular level. It does not wear a disguise. It becomes. When the Thing assimilates a dog, it is the dog. Every hair, every bark, every behavioral pattern, every biological marker. If you ran a blood test, you would get dog blood. When it assimilates a human, it replicates that human down to their memories, their vocal patterns, their mannerisms, their muscle memory. The original is gone. What remains is a perfect copy that continues the original's life without any observable break in continuity. The process requires a period of isolation with the target, even just a few minutes. The Thing extends biological tendrils, absorbs the host, processes and replicates them, and then resumes their existence seamlessly. The original does not die in any observable way. They simply stop being themselves. Something else takes over, wearing their face, carrying their memories, living their life. This is the engine that drives the central horror of Carpenter's film, which remains one of the most perfectly constructed exercises in paranoia in the history of cinema. If the Thing can be anyone, then no one in that Antarctic base can be trusted. Every interaction is potentially with an imitation. Every person who sleeps in the bunk next to yours could be waiting for the right moment. Every person who hands you a cup of coffee could be the last person you ever see. Carpenter understood that the most powerful version of this horror was not in the creature effects. Extraordinary as they are, Rob Bottin's practical work on this film is still among the most disturbing and inventive ever put on screen, but in what the threat does to the humans around it, the way it corrodes trust, the way it makes every relationship a potential trap, the way it forces people into a position where the rational response to anyone who might be infected is violence, which is exactly what the thing needs to continue spreading. The scenes in which the characters attempt to test each other for infection, particularly the blood test sequence, works so well not because of what the test reveals, but because of what the waiting for the results does to everyone in the room. Every person in that circle is watching every other person for the slightest sign of something wrong, knowing that if the thing is one of them, it is smart enough to show no sign at all. The monster has turned its hosts into weapons against each other, just by existing among them. But what places the thing on this list, and why it belongs as high as it does, is not just the paranoia it generates. It is the philosophical implications of what it actually is. The thing does not have a plan. It does not have an ideology, or a goal of conquest, or a hierarchy that could be negotiated with, or a weakness that could be targeted strategically. It simply survives. It replicates. From whatever passes for its perspective, it is not doing anything wrong. It is being what it is. This is where the thing overlaps with the cosmic horror tradition in a way that most monster movies never achieve. There is no villain. There is a mechanism, a biological process so completely indifferent to human concepts of identity, individuality, or moral consideration that applying those concepts to it is not just useless, but borderline absurd. The thing does not know that the people it replaces had loved ones. It does not know that the scientist it just assimilated was the only person who understood the equipment that might have detected it. It does not know anything. It just is. And it extends itself when it can, because that is what it does. And the implications of that, if the thing had ever left the Antarctic base, are staggering. One cell from one assimilated organism in the right conditions is enough to restart the process. The thing does not need a fleet. It does not need a strategy. It just needs to reach a populated area and enough time without detection. And because it can be anyone, because it passes every external and most internal examinations, because it has never needed to be loud or obvious or violent, the question of when detection would even happen is a genuinely chilling one. The ending of Carpenter's film leaves that question deliberately open. Two survivors sit in the wreckage of the base, unable to trust each other, unable to verify whether either of them is still human, watching the structures burn, and knowing that even if both of them are currently human, even if they both make it through the night, they cannot be certain what they might carry inside them. And the film ends there. On that uncertainty, on the face of a man looking at another man and not knowing. On the possibility that the process has already started somewhere, and they have no way of knowing where. That ending is not a failure to provide closure. It is the most honest conclusion the story could have, because the horror of the thing is not something that resolves. It just waits. Let us reduce the scale for a moment, because not every terrifying parasite on this list needs to operate at a planetary or cosmic level. Some of the most effective parasitic horror in fiction works precisely because it is immediate, physical, and cruelly efficient on a human scale. And few things in science fiction gaming have combined elegant simplicity with deeply unsettling implication, quite like the HeadCrabs from the Half-Life series. A headcrab at baseline is not a complex organism. Roughly the size of a large melon, its body is designed almost entirely around a single function, attaching to a human head. The underside is lined with manipulator appendages and a central mouth structure capable of penetrating the skull and interfacing directly with the human nervous system. When a headcrab leaps onto a host, and they do leap, they are surprisingly fast and alarmingly accurate. It anchors itself, breaks through the cranial structure, and takes direct control of the motor system. The host does not die immediately. This is the detail that Valve understood makes the headcrab genuinely horrifying rather than merely dangerous. The host survives the process. They retain a level of biological function. Their heart continues beating, their lungs continue breathing, their metabolic processes continue operating, but they no longer control any of it. The headcrab is driving now, and what it drives the body to do is move toward other humans, so that other headcrabs can do the same thing. The resulting creature, referred to in the games as a zombie, is a human body in a state of advanced biological takeover. The arms hang forward or pull backward, the torso hunches. The movements become erratic and aggressive. Everything about the body language communicates that something fundamentally wrong has happened to this person. And here is the detail that Valve embedded in the Half-Life games that a lot of players catch, but most do not consciously process until someone points it out. The sounds the zombies make are human screams, processed and distorted. If you reverse and clean the audio, you can hear recognizable words. You can hear pleas for help. You can hear someone, still in there, still aware of what is happening to their body, still trying to communicate, still trying to ask someone to make it stop. The head crab does not eliminate consciousness, it traps it. The person inside the zombie is still experiencing everything their body does. They are along for the ride, unable to influence anything, watching their own hands reach for other people, hearing their own voice making sounds they did not choose to make. If that does not represent one of the most nightmarish possible existences in all of horror, it is difficult to imagine what would. And then there are the variants. The poison head crab is physically smaller and more delicate looking than the standard variety, which makes it seem less threatening right up until it bites you. The venom it injects does not kill outright, but reduces a human to the absolute edge of survival, leaving them in a state of biological paralysis, while the head crab completes the attachment process. The resulting poison zombie is faster and more aggressive than the standard variety, capable of launching venom sacs at targets from a distance, a projectile weapon made from the host's own modified biology. But the black head crab is the variant that fully earns its place on a list about parasitic horror. When a black head crab attaches to a host, it does not simply take control, it initiates a rapid and catastrophic physical mutation. The host body is restructured from the inside, elongated, reinforced, partially externalized at the skeletal level, the torso capable of bending backward to a degree that should not be physically possible. What emerges from this process is one of the most disturbing enemy designs in Half-Life 2, a creature that is clearly still human in origin, that still makes those reversed, distorted screams, but that now exists in a state so far beyond what any human body should be that the connection to the original person feels like a mockery. The human inside is still screaming. It is just harder to recognize them now. The head crab's place in the broader lore of Half-Life adds another dimension of horror, the Combine, the alien empire that conquered Earth between the events of Half-Life and Half-Life 2, appear to use head crabs as a biological weapon, deploying them via suppression device canisters into human populations to convert civilians into threats to other civilians. The head crab is not just a predator, it is a tool, a weapon built from the enemy's own biology, turned against the enemy's own people, requiring none of the Combine's resources to maintain once deployed. The most efficient possible weapon is one that replenishes itself using its target. If the Genestealers are the most patient parasitic force on this list, and the thing is the most philosophically disorienting, the Flood from the Halo universe is the one that operates at the largest scale, and that most completely and explicitly crosses the boundary into pure cosmic horror. The Flood is a parasitic life form of extragalactic origin in the Halo universe. And I use the term life form with deliberate care because the Flood is not a species in any conventional sense. It is a collective intelligence, a unified consciousness of immeasurable scale that manifests through millions of individual infected organisms acting as components of a single organism. The entry point of the infection is what are called flood infection forms, small creatures roughly the size of a human head that seek out living hosts, penetrate the torso, and fuse with the central nervous system. A host that survives the initial attack long enough is converted into a combat form, a mutated, structurally modified version of the original creature, now a physical extension of the Flood Collective. What soldiers in the Halo universe call the Flood zombies, though that description understates what they actually are. Combat forms are not just reanimated bodies. They are nodes in a real-time tactical network, receiving and transmitting strategic information from every other Flood organism in the theater of operations, capable of adapting their approach based on collective data in a way no individual soldier could match. But the architecture of the Flood goes far beyond combat forms. Carrier forms are hosts that have been fully consumed and rebuilt as delivery vehicles for infection forms, mobile incubators that move toward uninfected targets and rupture themselves when close enough, releasing swarms of infection forms in every direction simultaneously. They do not fight in any conventional sense. They are living grenades, and they do not know it, and it does not matter. Pure forms represent a further stage of flood evolution, organisms that have grown beyond the need for a specific host body, generating their own biomass from environmental matter. They are flood that no longer need other life forms to exist. The parasite has become self-sufficient. It has built its own substrate. And presiding over all of this, the entity that represents the closest thing the flood has to a central consciousness is the grave mind. The grave mind is something that defies easy categorization. It is an enormous entity, physically colossal, built from the fused and reconfigured remains of millions of absorbed individuals. But what makes it significant is not its size. What makes it significant is what it has accumulated. Every individual that the flood has ever absorbed has contributed their memories, their knowledge, their understanding to the grave mind. Not just the recent victims, the historical ones, the civilizational ones. The grave mind has been growing and absorbing for longer than most species in the Halo universe have existed. It contains the complete recorded knowledge of civilizations that have been extinct for hundreds of thousands of years. It has processed the entire intellectual output of races that nothing else in the galaxy even remembers. The result is an entity that is not merely intelligent, but is possessed of a perspective on existence that is fundamentally incompatible with any individual life form's framework for understanding reality. It does not think about years or centuries or even millennia the way living beings do. It thinks across geological timescales, across the entire arc of galactic history, and from that vantage point, every individual struggle, every civilization's rise and fall, every act of heroism or survival is simply a very small part of a very large process that has always been moving toward the same inevitable conclusion. When the grave mind speaks in the games, it does so in a cadence that is almost poetic, almost liturgical, almost reasonable, which is the most unsettling possible register for something that wants to absorb all life in the galaxy. It does not rant or rage, it explains. It presents its argument with the patience and clarity of something that has been refining that argument for longer than your civilization has existed. Its argument is, essentially, that the flood offers a form of preservation. Individual death is the great tragedy of biological existence. Everything that a person is, everything they experienced and understood and felt, is lost when they die. The flood solves that problem. The flood absorbs and retains. Nothing that the flood has touched is truly lost. It becomes part of something permanent, something that cannot die the way individuals die. The horror of that argument is not that it is obviously wrong. The horror is that there is a certain kind of logic to it that you can follow for a few steps before the full implications arrive. And when they do arrive, when you fully absorb the idea that preservation in this context means the dissolution of every boundary between self and collective, the elimination of individual consciousness as a distinct entity, the conversion of everything you are into one more voice in an infinite chorus that you will never be able to leave, the argument becomes something much darker than a philosophical position. The Halo universe contains a piece of lore that many players know, but whose full weight is easy to underestimate. The Forerunners, a civilization that predated humanity by millions of years, that was technologically advanced enough to build ring-shaped megastructures hundreds of thousands of kilometers in circumference, reached a point in their conflict with the Flood where their best strategic option was the complete destruction of all sentient life in the galaxy. Not to defeat the Flood, to starve it, to deny it any possible hosts across 100,000 light-years of space and buy enough time for a potential recovery. They built the Halos for this purpose, weapons capable of destroying every sentient organism in the galaxy simultaneously, to be fired only as a last resort. They nearly had to fire them. A civilization with millions of years of technological development, with the ability to manipulate matter at a stellar scale, with weapons capable of ending all life in a galaxy, considered the systematic extermination of all sentient life the most viable strategic option against this parasite. That is the scale of the Flood. No list about parasitic horror in fiction can exist without addressing what has become arguably the most culturally prominent example of the concept in recent years, partly because of the HBO series, but more fundamentally because of what Naughty Dog built in the original game. A world in which a single fungal mutation ended civilization, and the fungus is still winning. The genius of The Last of Us begins with its grounding in reality. The Cordyceps unilateralis, which we mentioned at the top of this video, is real. The behavior it induces in ants is real. The process of growing through a living organism and ultimately rupturing the head to distribute spores is real. Naughty Dog's creative team began with that reality and asked a single question. What if it jumped to humans? The answer they arrived at is one of the most thoroughly considered apocalyptic scenarios in gaming history. In the world of The Last of Us, a mutated strain of Cordyceps began spreading through the human population, transmitted through spores and direct contact with infected tissue. Within months, the infrastructure of modern civilization collapsed. Within years, most of the world's population was either dead, infected, or surviving in fortified military quarantine zones that were, in many cases, barely better than the world outside their walls. The infection progresses through distinct stages, and each stage is carefully designed to maximize both the biological plausibility and the psychological horror. The first stage produces what the game calls runners. These are the recently infected within the first day or two of exposure, and they are in many ways the most psychologically disturbing of all the infected categories, because they are the most human. They have not yet lost enough motor control or cognitive function to be slow or predictable. They move with the speed and coordination of a healthy person. They attack with the strength of someone in a state of complete biochemical panic. But there are moments, fractions of seconds, where something in the body language suggests the person inside is still present, still fighting, still terrified, before the fungus overrides them again. After roughly 2 weeks of infection, the fungus has grown enough within the skull to begin destroying the optical structures. At this point, the host is functionally blind, but the Cordyceps has compensated for this by developing an alternative sensory system. Echolocation through the rhythmic clicking sound that gives this stage of infection its name. Clickers are significantly stronger than runners, significantly harder to kill, and react to the faintest sounds with instantaneous and lethal aggression. The fungal growth that has broken through the skull and spread across the face is not cosmetic. It is structural. It has reinforced the head in ways that make conventional attacks significantly less effective. The later stages, bloaters and shamblers, represent what happens to a host after years or decades of infection, when the fungus has had time to grow beyond the interior of the body and begin producing exterior plating. Bloaters are encased in a thick layer of hardened fungal matter that acts as natural armor. They can tear off chunks of their own body and hurl them as incendiary projectiles. The spore sacs of the fungus weaponized by the host's own movement. They are not faster than the earlier stages. They do not need to be. They are walking fortresses that the fungus has built around the bones and organs of what used to be a person. But the most unsettling single detail of the Cordyceps infection in The Last of Us is not about any specific stage of infected behavior. It is about the network. The HBO series explored this in a particularly effective way in its first episode, when a mycologist speaking in what appears to be a news interview in 1968, decades before the events of the story, describes what a fungal pandemic in humans might look like. He does not describe the infected as zombies with a shared goal. He describes them as cells in a single organism. Each infected individual is a node in a network connected by mycelia, the underground filamentous threads that fungi use to communicate and transport resources. When one part of the network is threatened, the signal travels. Other parts respond. This means that the environment itself, in areas of heavy infestation, is already part of the organism. The ground is threaded with the network. The walls of buildings that have been colonized for years are part of the network. When you step on the wrong section of floor in a Cordyceps-heavy environment, something somewhere knows where you are. The person you are standing in front of has not made the decision to attack you. The organism has. The Cordyceps of The Last of Us does something that most parasitic horror fiction struggles with. It is genuinely and coherently terrifying at every level simultaneously. On the biological level, it is grounded enough in real science that you can follow the logic without it feeling like hand-waving. On the psychological level, it produces infected that trigger deep discomfort through the traces of humanity still visible in their behavior. On the civilizational level, it demonstrates with harrowing specificity exactly how quickly and completely one biological change can dismantle everything humanity has built. And on the cosmic scale, it presents a fungal organism that does not have goals, does not have intentions. does not have any awareness of human civilization at all, and for whom the complete erasure of that civilization is not an act of malice, but simply the natural consequence of doing what fungi do. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you already know that dead space comes up often, and there is a very specific reason for that. The Necromorph Infection is not just one of the most creative and disturbing parasitic mechanisms in horror gaming. It is the one that most directly and explicitly operates at the intersection of biological horror and cosmic horror, and it does so with a coherence and completeness of vision that is genuinely impressive. Let us start with the source, the marker. The marker is an alien artifact of unclear origin that appears at multiple points in human history, and, as is later revealed in the lore, in the history of civilizations that predated humanity. It is an object that should not exist by any conventional understanding of physics or engineering. A double helix structure of massive scale that emits a complex electromagnetic signal reaching any sufficiently developed nervous system in its vicinity. That signal, the marker signal, does two things depending on the recipient. In the living, it induces hallucinations of increasing severity, eventually producing full psychotic breaks, and, in extreme cases, complete dissociation from reality. In the dead, it reactivates necrotic tissue and begins a process of biological restructuring that produces the necromorphs. And that restructuring is not a simple reanimation. This is the critical distinction. The marker signal does not wake up dead bodies and tell them to walk around. It uses the raw biological material of those dead bodies as a construction medium to build something entirely new. The necromorphs are not zombies. They are assembled. They are structures built from organic matter, optimized not for any particular form of locomotion or behavior that the original body was designed for, but for a single unified purpose, killing living organisms and producing more raw material for the marker to work with. The physical results of this are genuinely disturbing in their specificity. Slasher-class necromorphs are built around rerouted upper limbs, the arms repositioned and reinforced into blade-like structures. Pregnants are built from female hosts, the abdominal cavity converted into an incubation chamber for a swarm of smaller necromorphs that are released on rupture. Lurkers are constructed from infant hosts, the limbs repurposed as multi-directional projectile launchers. Every variant represents a different optimization, a different solution to the engineering problem of converting a specific type of organic material into the most effective possible killing machine for its context. There is no mercy anywhere in this taxonomy. The marker does not distinguish between combatants and civilians, between adults and children, between the recently deceased and those dead for hours. Everything organic, everything that still carries enough biological complexity to be worked with, is a potential construction material. But the mechanics of the infection, as disturbing as they are not the deepest horror of dead space. The deepest horror is the purpose. The marker does not create necromorphs as an end in itself. It creates necromorphs to produce more dead matter, more raw biological material, more fuel for a process that the lore calls the convergence event. The convergence is what happens when enough necromorphic biomass has accumulated in one place. The marker signal activates a final phase assembly process, drawing together all of that accumulated dead organic matter and constructing from it an entity of planetary scale, a moon-sized organism of necromorphic tissue possessed of consciousness and drive that is itself a marker at astronomical scale. A brethren moon, once formed, can travel through space under its own propulsion. It can identify inhabited planets, and when it arrives at one, it brings its own marker signal, triggering the entire process again. The brethren moons are the markers that survive their own convergence events. They are the end product, the fourth generation. To bring back an earlier metaphor, the parasite at its final intended form. This reframes everything that happens in the Dead Space games in a way that retroactively makes it all more horrifying. The initial necromorph outbreak on the USG Ishimura, the military operations on Titan Station, every incident in the series, is not a malfunction or an accident or an act of alien aggression. It is a biological process unfolding according to design. The marker does not want to destroy humanity. It wants to use humanity. It wants to use every cell of every human body ever produced, and every organism on every planet it can reach, to build more of itself. Isaac Clarke's story across 3 games, which I have talked about at length in another video, is the story of one man trying to interrupt a process that has been successfully completing itself on planet after planet for longer than his species has existed. He succeeds in destroying one brethren moon. By the time he does, the others have already arrived at Earth. His victory was a delay. The process was always going to continue. We arrive at one that I think is consistently underrated in conversations about parasitic horror, partly because Paul Verhoeven's 1997 adaptation of Robert Heinlein's novel is so deliberately and brilliantly wrapped in the aesthetics of military propaganda satire that it is easy to watch the whole film and come away thinking primarily about the political commentary. But underneath the gleaming uniforms and the recruitment reel production values, Starship Troopers contains something genuinely terrifying, and it is the brain bug. The arachnid civilization in Starship Troopers is a hive-based extraterrestrial species organized into biological castes, each optimized for a specific function in the collective war effort. Warrior bugs are the infantry, fast and aggressive, designed to close distances and dismember. Tanker bugs are living artillery, biological heavy weapons. Hopper bugs are mobile air support. The taxonomy is elaborate and, within the world of the film, logistically coherent. But the brain bug is where the arachnid biological design reaches something that crosses the boundary from science fiction threat to horror concept. A brain bug is a massive creature, roughly the size of a large vehicle, with a soft and defensively vulnerable primary body structure that it never exposes to combat. It sits at the center of arachnid tactical operations, behind every layer of defense the hive can construct. And the reason it is so carefully protected is what it does, and what it can do to the enemies that fail to prevent it from doing it. The brain bug possesses a proboscis, an extensible biological instrument that can penetrate a human skull and establish a direct neural interface with the brain inside. Once that interface is established, the brain bug does not inject anything. It extracts. It draws the contents of the brain, not the physical tissue, but the information encoded in it, into itself. Memories, knowledge, tactical information, strategic plans, access codes, classified data. Everything that person knew, everything they understood, everything they had spent their career learning and storing is transferred in seconds to the brain bug and from there to the collective intelligence of the arachnid hive. The scene in Carpenter's film in which this happens to the character of Dizzy is one of the most viscerally confrontational moments in 90s science fiction cinema, and it works because Verhoeven does not cut away. You see the proboscis, you see the penetration, you see the expression on the face during the extraction, and then you see what is left afterward, which is, in the most important sense, nothing. A body with its contents removed. The strategic implications of this are what elevate the brain bug from merely disturbing to genuinely terrifying. Every captured soldier is not just a casualty, it is a security breach. Every officer the brain bug gets access to is an intelligence gift. If the captured individual knew the positions of every human military installation in the theater, the brain bug now knows them. If they knew the command structure of the entire mobile infantry force, the brain bug now knows it. If they knew the classified research being conducted on the brain bug's potential weaknesses, the brain bug now knows that too. In the extended lore of Starship Troopers, the brain bugs function as the cognitive center of the entire arachnid civilization. The warrior and tanker castes are the body. The brain bugs are the mind, and they feed that mind, in the most literal possible sense, on the minds of their enemies. There is a category of horror that focuses on the violation of the physical body, the skin and bone and blood, and a separate category that focuses on the violation of the mental self, memory, identity, consciousness, the things that make you who you are rather than simply what you are. Most parasitic horror lives in the first category. The HeadCrabs, the Cordyceps, the Necromorphs, the body is the target. The brain bug operates entirely in the second category. It does not want your body. Your body is of no interest to it. What it wants is the thing inside your head that you have spent your entire life constructing, the accumulated knowledge and experience and understanding that constitutes your identity as a thinking being. And once it takes that, there is nothing left of you that matters. The body that remains after the extraction is just a container that has been emptied. The ending of Verhoeven's film captures something important about this when the captured brain bug emits what is interpreted as a fear response, and Karma notes that it is afraid. That moment of apparent vulnerability is interesting for exactly the reason that makes it unsettling. If the brain bug can feel fear, it is also studying fear. It is absorbing the experience of being afraid, learning from it, adding it to everything else it has consumed. Even in defeat, even in captivity, the brain bug is feeding. The parasite that learns from everything, including its own suffering, is the parasite that never stops improving. And here we are at the top of the list, and I fully expect this to be the most controversial placement. Many of you, I imagine, expected the thing to take the first spot. Some of you had money on the Flood or the Necromorphs, and I understand those arguments. But I have very specific reasons for placing the Byram from Stephen King's Dreamcatcher, both the 2001 novel and the 2003 film adaptation, at the top of this list. And I think by the time I finish explaining them, most of you will understand why. Let me start with what the Byram are and how they work. The Byram are an extraterrestrial life form that arrives in the forests of Maine during what initially appears to be a meteorite impact event. Their basic physical form is that of an eel-like or lamprey-like creature, roughly comparable in size to a large eel, covered in teeth that serve dual functions as locomotion aids and tissue penetration instruments. Their coloration is a deep reddish brown. King's descriptions in the novel, which are extremely specific in ways that most writers would have had the restraint to dial back, compare the texture and appearance to raw liver. That comparison is not accidental. King is doing something very deliberate with the Byram's design by making them as viscerally repulsive as possible in a way that activates not just fear, but disgust, which is a different and in some ways more deeply rooted response. Disgust is older than fear as an evolutionary mechanism. Disgust says, "Do not touch this. Do not go near this. This will contaminate you." Horror that triggers genuine disgust rather than just fear is operating on a more primitive level, and King understood exactly what he was doing. The infection mechanism of the Byram is straightforward in concept and absolutely horrifying in execution. The Byram enter the human body through any available orifice. The word "any" is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and King's novel makes the full implications of it explicit in ways that require a certain fortitude to read. Once inside, they travel to the digestive tract, where they feed, grow, and reproduce. The host begins to show symptoms within hours, a distinctive rash appearing in small red dots that form patterns resembling star maps or constellations, a sweetish and deeply wrong odor that the characters describe as rot, trying to smell like something pleasant, and an increasingly urgent sense that something inside needs to get out. Because it does. The Byram, once they have grown and reproduced sufficiently, must exit the host body, and the manner of their exit is the scene that Stephen King himself has acknowledged is one of the most extreme pieces of body horror in his entire career. The scene in question involves a character named Pete Moore, infected and alone in a cabin in the Maine woods, who discovers what is happening inside him and attempts to contain the situation. What follows is a sequence of several pages in the novel that is difficult to summarize without doing a disservice to the full horror King constructed, but involves Pete attempting to keep an occupied bathroom fixture closed with the full weight of his body, while something on the other side makes very clear that it is not going to stay contained. The Byram exits. The exit is not clean. Pete does not survive the scene. The film adaptation handles this sequence in a way that is both explicit enough to generate genuine visceral distress in viewers and restrained enough compared to the source material that some readers of the novel consider it almost tame. The combination of King's written description and the practical effects work in Kasdan's film creates something that occupies a very specific frequency of horror, one that bypasses the intellectual processing that most horror triggers and goes directly for the biological revulsion response. But if the Byram were only this, they would be a very well-constructed gross-out. They would be on this list, but not at the top of it. What elevates them to number one is Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray is the intelligence that directs the Byram, but he is not the Byram themselves. He is something separate, an alien consciousness that uses the Byram as a delivery system and vector, but whose primary mode of infection is entirely cognitive. Mr. Gray does not need to enter your body through an orifice. He enters your mind. When Mr. Gray infects the character of Jonesy, the central human figure of the story's main narrative, he does not eliminate Jonesy's consciousness. He does not overwrite it or suppress it the way a headcrab does or the Cordyceps does. He moves in alongside it. He takes control of the body and uses Jonesy's accumulated knowledge of human behavior, language, custom, and environment to navigate the world convincingly. Meanwhile, Jonesy himself remains fully conscious, fully present, fully aware of everything that is happening. King gives this experience a concrete and specific metaphorical form. Jonesy retreats to what he thinks of as his memory warehouse, a mental space that he has used since childhood as a storage system for thoughts and recollections. From inside the warehouse, he can see out. He can watch what Mr. Gray does with his body. He can hear the conversations Mr. Gray has with his face and his voice. He can feel the revulsion and the helplessness and the specific horror of watching someone. He cannot stop wearing him like a costume and use him to move through the world. This is the horror of possession taken to its most complete and specific imaginative realization. Not the horror of having your body taken. Not the horror of being controlled like a puppet with no awareness of your own situation. The horror of being a fully conscious, fully intact person who is trapped inside their own body watching someone else run it. Watching your hands do things you did not choose. Watching your mouth say things you did not mean. Watching the people who know you interact with what they think is you, and having absolutely no way to tell them what is actually happening. Jonesy, across the narrative of Dreamcatcher, has to find ways to interfere with Mr. Gray's plans from inside the warehouse. He manages, with extreme difficulty, to influence things at the margins, to hide information, to create minor obstacles, to do what a prisoner can do when the guard is not paying close attention. But he is always the prisoner. He is always operating from a position of fundamental powerlessness within what should be the space over which he has the most absolute dominion, his own mind. The combination that King constructed with the Byram and Mr. Gray is, I would argue, the most complete and thorough parasitic horror concept in the tradition. Not the most powerful, not the most cosmically scaled, but the most thorough because it attacks on every level simultaneously and leaves nothing untouched. At the biological level, the Byram are among the most discussed triggering organisms in horror fiction, designed with a precision that goes beyond simple grossness into something that activates genuinely deep evolutionary responses. At the cognitive level, Mr. Gray represents the absolute worst version of the loss of mental autonomy that all possession horror gestures toward, but rarely commits to with this degree of specificity. At the psychological level, the experience of Jonesy watching himself from the warehouse is one of the most accurate fictional representations of what it would actually feel like to be in that situation, which is what makes it so hard to shake. King wrote Dreamcatcher during his recovery from the 1999 accident in which he was struck by a van and nearly killed, and interviews from the period make clear that the novel emerged from a period of intense focus on bodily vulnerability, on the unreliability of the physical form, on the way an external event can reduce the most fundamental act of physical autonomy, controlling your own body, to something contingent and fragile. The Byram are the nightmare version of that experience. The moment where the van does not stop at injury, where it goes all the way, where what enters from outside does not just hurt you, but replaces the driver entirely. The most effective horror is always the kind that knows exactly which anxiety it is reaching for and reaches for it with precision. The Byram reach for the oldest and most unavoidable one, the fact that your body, the thing you inhabit and rely on more completely than anything else in your existence, is not as fully yours as you have always needed to believe. A monster outside the door can be escaped. A threat in the environment can be avoided. A cosmic entity can perhaps be survived by being small and unimportant enough to be overlooked. But a parasite is already inside, and once it is inside, the question of what is you and what is the parasite, the question of where you end and it begins, is one that does not have a clean answer anymore. That is the horror that every entry on this list, in its own way, is trying to get at. The Genestealers rewrite your bloodline. The thing replaces you entirely. The head crab traps you inside your own body while it drives. The flood absorbs you into a collective that never forgets. The Cordyceps builds a new organism using your skeleton as scaffolding. The Necromorphs use your dead body as raw construction material. The brain bug extracts everything you are and leaves the container empty. And the Byram, King's liver-colored nightmare from the Maine woods, do all of the above at once. There is no clean resolution to what a parasite represents. That is the point. That is why horror keeps returning to the concept. Because the parasite, at its core, is the ultimate violation, not of your safety, but of your selfhood. And your selfhood is the one thing you are never supposed to be able to lose. That is going to do it for this one. A list that covers everything from planetary-scale biological warfare to the deeply personal horror of a man trapped inside his own mind, watching someone else use his body to buy groceries. The common thread across all of these is the one that the best horror always finds. Not the thing outside threatening to destroy you, but the thing inside. The contamination that has already occurred, the process already underway, that you cannot fight because you cannot even cleanly locate where it is. If this video gave you something to think about, a like helps the channel enormously. If there is a parasitic horror concept from fiction that you think belongs on this list and I left out, put it in the comments. There is enough material in this genre for a second part, easily. And if the response warrants it, that is exactly what we will do. Until the next one.